times of chaos and breakdown, where might we turn for guidance? To the myths, the storytellers, the wisdom keepers, and the rabble-rousers. To the ones braving the seas of uncertainty, not with answers, but with poetry, beauty, and well-crafted questions. I'm Ian MacKenzie, co-founder of the School of Mythopoetics, a place to gather with like-hearted folks to navigate the mysteries together. And this is The Crow's Nest, where I speak with an array of guests who are employing their mythic imagination to engage with the tempest of the times. You're invited to join me live on YouTube each week. Visit schoolofmythopoetics.com/podcast to learn more. And now, enjoy our conversation. Greetings, friends. Thank you for tuning in to this edition of The Crow's Nest. And I'm delighted to jump right in with my guest, who I've had the pleasure of actually speaking with a few times already. The first was for my podcast, The Mythic Masculine, where we spoke of the Grail, the Dragon, and the Wild Men, as well as a gathering of stories, where this guest offered a beautiful rendition of Parzival in the Grail Tale to our attendees. And so, a little more about my guest today. Dr. Sharon Blackie is an award-winning psychologist, writer, and mythologist. Her highly acclaimed books, courses, lectures, and workshops are focused on the development of the mythic imagination and on the relevance of myth, fairy tales, and folk traditions to the personal, social, and environmental problems we face today. As well as writing 5 books of fiction and nonfiction, including the bestselling If Women Rose Rooted, she's the author of the just-released book, Hagitude, aimed at women who wish to reimagine the second half of their life. And so I'm delighted to welcome Sharon Blackie. Welcome.
Thank you, Ian. It's lovely to be in conversation with you again.
And I'd love to jump right into the title of the book, because as I read, you had a really kind of startling moment of revelation in coming to the title. And I wonder if you might share that story.
Yeah, it was just a bit strange, really. So I literally woke up in the middle of the night, sat bolt upright in bed and said the word Hagitude to the bedroom at large, and then fell back to sleep again. And the next morning when I woke up, I remembered it unusually, and I thought, that probably could be a good title for a book that I had already begun to think of writing. So it became Hagitude.
What do you think those moments are? Like, is it the muses inserting themselves into your reality, or is it some other ancestral whispering? Like, how do you understand those kind of moments of creative revelation?
Oh, I think that in the middle of the night, particularly when we're dreaming, we are in a sense tapped into the anima mundi, or the world soul, what Jung would have called the collective unconscious once upon a time, and that there are many things floating around there that we are more open to. So yeah, I think of it as a whisper from somebody or something that was actually very useful in stimulating the vision that I was developing for the book at the time, which was very kind of hagitudinal, I suppose, if I can use that as an adjective. Yeah.
I think you've coined a new word, and I'd love to unpack too. Hags with attitude seems to be the combination, right, of that word, and I wonder why this book, and why now?
Well, the hags with attitude thing, yeah, I guess. I just want to say that, hag, in most parts of the world probably would be seen as a very negative title. And so it's certainly something that a lot of women find it a little bit difficult to embrace wholeheartedly at the beginning. But the hags in the old stories, the old women in European myth and folklore who were called hags, had a specific set of characteristics, which I think is really important. So they weren't necessarily old and frail, which the word crone often depicts. Crone is very much at the elder stage of elderhood. Hags could be anything from midlife onwards all the way through, and they were all very much sufficient unto themselves. They were who they were because of who they were, not because of their relationship to anybody else, not because of the way they were defined in the culture. They had a particular kind of wisdom and a particular kind of power, and they weren't afraid to use it. And so I think hag actually can be a very empowering word for women. So that's why, given the state of the world, and given the fact that elder women as also elder men, perhaps to a lesser extent, are generally perceived to be inconvenient or preferred to be invisible. It just seemed to me that it was perhaps about time that we got over that and came back.
Mm. You have a line here where you say, "How we think about aging women depends on the images we hold of them." This is in the opening of the book, and it says, "If there's no clear image of enviable female elderhood in the contemporary cultural mythology, well, you say that about the West. Therefore, it's hard to recognize the value." Is sort of what what I'm translating about that. So, how is it that you've turned to myths and stories to provide these archetypal images of what? Like, how has the book arranged itself to provide these kinds of images?
Well, I think there are for sure inspirational elder women in the culture, or have been. I think of Joanna Macy, I think of Doris Lessing, I think of Ursula Le Guin, all kinds of, even Germaine Greer. I think I think of those women in the culture as very powerful and very important. But what I was doing here began with a kind of research project, which was to go back to the old European myths and fairy tales and say, okay, elder women are not almost ever the protagonists of these stories. They're not the heroines or heroes. But when you look at them, they're almost always, in some sense, running the show, pulling the strings. They have the bigger picture of the world. They know what needs to be done to bring the world into balance, to set the hero or the heroine off on a meaningful and authentic path. And I was looking for different ways of being an elder woman in the myths and fairy tales of Europe. And that was the interesting thing that I found, that there wasn't just one way, there wasn't just one archetype of female elderhood. There were many different types of female elderhood, everything from the fairy godmother to the loathly lady to Baba Yaga, the dangerous old woman in the woods. And I think this is really important because it gives us a whole set of inspirations, and each of us with our own unique gift will find inspiration, I think, from one of those archetypes.
Mm. What archetypes would you say that you resonate most with? Maybe at certain times of life, or ones that you wish to cultivate more. As you wrote the book, even were you like, oh wow, yeah, this one I'd love to, step more into this, or actually, you know what, maybe tone that one down.
Well, ever since I was a young child, I always loved the wise old woman in the woods. The woman who was
Mm,
slightly hidden. She didn't advertise her wares, but she was there for anybody to find. She was quiet and very, very grounded, very, very connected to the world around her. And I never related to the princesses in stories. I didn't grow up in a very princessy kind of
mm,
environment. And I always, from a very early age, wanted to be that wise old woman in the woods. And I think I've always been drawn to that. But my path up until very recently has taken me into a much more visible kind of
mm,
teaching kind of path. And I've never been entirely comfortable with that. And I've always felt that the older I got, the more it would be okay to really take on these attributes of the wise old woman in the woods, because I think she is I think she gains strength, that character, from her ability to be silent and completely tuned into the world around her without the noise of civilization and
mm,
contraptions and social media in the contemporary world. And I really do resonate with that stillness and that deep vision that results from it. So I love that character. I kind of love the truth teller as well,
mm,
who is, although that's a very complex one and it has got to be done with care. The truth teller who is in many ways tied up a little bit with the trickster archetype. So I think those are
mm,
probably the two that I really most relate to.
mm. As I looked through the structure of the book as well, yeah, it was beautifully arranged. It felt like with these different archetypal illuminations, with stories, and in particular, yeah, you spoke about the trickster and um, the hag is trickster, within a culture. And when does that medicine, you could say, sometimes hard medicine for a certain cultural moment or certain societies that have been too stuck or too sure of themselves or too pushing beyond limits, when does that important medicine become necessary, and how might it be delivered?
It becomes necessary when the cultural mythology, the story that we are told by the culture that we are to live by, becomes arid and no longer serves us. And that's the point at which something needs to come along and disrupt the cultural narrative. Now, trickster in most cultures, not all, in some cultures, trickster is simply a joker kind of character. But in most cultures, and certainly in European mythology, trickster is much more a disruptor. That is the essence of the trickster archetype, disruption. So trickster comes in and shakes everything up, usually in a very, very uncomfortable way when everything is going to hell in a handbasket. And, I wrote a few years ago when we in the UK had just done Brexit, and you were just about or had just elected Donald Trump, not you in Canada, but in North America, in the States, had elected Donald Trump. And I wrote a blog post about that archetype of trickster's disruptor, and said you don't always get the trickster that you want, but you almost always get the trickster that you deserve. Because what trickster does, as well as just plain disrupting, is trickster holds up a mirror to what we can think of as the cultural shadow, the shadow in Jungian terms, the bits of us that we don't really want to admit to. Oh, we're a very enlightened culture. We love everybody. We care about people. And then somebody comes along who, then becomes the face of the culture, who is absolutely the opposite of that and forces us to really question, to look at ourselves in the mirror. And that, although it's often very uncomfortable and often doesn't necessarily end well, is a necessary function without which we can't grow and transform.
What gets in the way then? You speak here of, I'll read the line. It's why so few of us investigate the rich possibilities of growing older or undertake the necessary inner work that prepares us for a passage into a more conscious and meaningful elderhood. What is it that prevents, let's say, olders from recognizing or taking those steps, to put themselves, it seems initiatory, right, in a different way than, say, initiation is for youth, right, who come from, adolescent into adulthood. Might you speak to, what is that initiation from, let's say, midlife into this now new function?
Yeah, I mean, we don't do it because, again, the culture doesn't provide us with opportunities or narratives within which we can fit if we do that. So we are told that we must. The myth, one of the cultural myths that we're living by, is the myth of more, as I call it, the myth of progress. Every generation must be better, richer, have bigger houses, whatever, live longer than the generation before. And so we're taught that we must always be striving all the way through our lives until we effectively stop and wait to drop dead. And instead of that, and women particularly also are taught that they must also hold on to what the culture thinks of as beauty at all costs, and retain their youth for as long as they can, so that they look as if they're still fertile for as long as they can. And from a depth psychology perspective, from a Jungian and post-Jungian perspective, life is completely different. So Jung described the first half of life as the building, the growing, the creating part of life. Then we pause. Literally, women, it's not just our menses that pause. It's a psychological pause where we step back, or as I like to think of it, we fall into a place between stories and we wait for a new story to emerge. And the function of the second half of life in a Jungian perspective is what Jung called individuation. It's growing into your most authentic self, becoming who you were always meant to be when all of the trappings that civilization has piled upon you are stripped away. So, effectively, what is your essence? Who are you? Why are you here? And that to me is the journey through elderhood. Excuse me.
And what would you say then is, what are some of the ways in which maybe it's shown up for you or it's shown up for other women, making that traverse, right? Is it, much time alone, sort of moving away from all of the reminders, maybe of what their life has been, or what are the kind of trials or, commitments, let's say, that can show up to provide that bridge or to, that metamorphosis?
Well, I do think of menopause, if we're paying attention and we give ourselves time to do it. And I don't mean we take 6 months off work, because none of us can afford to do that these days. But if we're actually listening to our body and listening to what seems to be required of us, um, then I think we do fall into a quieter, more inward-looking space. And I'm sorry, Ian, I've got a tickle in my throat. That's not very helpful when I'm live and I don't have any water
No
with me.
problem.
Um, how can we do this? So I can go and get
Mm,
some water.
sure. Well,
Can
I'd be
we
happy
talk?
to maybe read. Yeah, I could
I'll
read
read
something while you
something.
wanted to.
Would
Yeah,
that be okay?
yeah,
I'm so sorry.
y-
Okay.
yeah. No problem at all. Yeah, please go right ahead. Maybe this is a good time actually as well to invite questions. Reading the field. So if there's any people listening now, as you are, as I can tell, and you have questions, or comments on our conversation, feel free to write them down now in the chat window, and when Sharon comes back, we can weave them in.
Okay, I think I'll live.
All
Sorry
right,
about
no
that.
problem. No problem. We
I
just
was on.
invited the listeners to post some comments and things, and
Mhm.
so it's fine to pick up again where we left off in our conversation, and if those roll in, we can weave them. But
Okay.
yeah, I could rephrase the question if
No,
helpful,
I think I remember where I was. So if we're listening and
please.
paying attention, then we
Mhm.
we automatically fall into a more inward-looking perspective on life, and in that space, lots of things emerge that perhaps we weren't aware of. So I think of menopause in particular as a kind of alchemical process. So we're in the crucible, and we are
Mm,
literally, as anyone who's been through menopause and faced all the hot flushes will remember, we are literally burning away the superfluities, everything that we thought, defined us, everything that we thought was necessary to be who we are, and they're burnt away. And we're left, and that is the nature of the initiation. I think for women at menopause, it really is a kind of a burning. And so what we're left with is a kind of space where, again, if we're paying attention, we can wait for a new story to present itself to us, or wait to grow into a new story, which is where, again, we circle back to where the archetypes and the stories come in to give us inspiration for that next part of the
mm,
journey.
hmm. There's a couple threads I could decide to go down. One that's just really curious to me as well is, you speak here. I said, we need women who will challenge the worst excesses of the patriarchy and who won't pull their punches while they're doing it. Uh, and there's something as well that you speak to of this from this patriarchal understanding, and by patriarchy again can be a complex kind of thing to unpack, but from this understanding though of essentially a culture which tends to venerate and uphold the maiden archetype. This is my understanding too. Yeah, the maiden is because again this fresh feminine, docile kind of archetype, and then the mother is sort of tolerated as a sort of procreative force, but generally before the kid's born, all of the oh, you look so good, the glow and everything, and then after, the mom is all of a sudden a little too much to meet the mother archetype, is also a whole other initiation, let's say, often for men. But let's just say then beyond that, of course, it's like, okay, mostly invisible and do kind of out of the way. And so what is it though to reclaim a necessary seat when the culture at large, for example, sees elder women as either invisible or um, sort of unnecessary, in a sense that not seeing actually what the sort of generative possibilities that they bring, that it takes a kind of confrontation there. I guess that's what I'm hearing in what you're saying, uh, and the courage it takes for, I think, women in this period of life to sort of really step out of that paradigm, right, of saying, of that comparative paradigm of the to the maiden and all that, and actually step into something else which feels like it's a truing to life, right? What is life actually asking for them to step into? I wonder if you might speak to that.
Yeah, and I would say that, confrontation isn't necessarily a part of all of those archetypes. I mean, some of them are very quiet archetypes, like the old woman in the woods, or even like Baba Yaga, who has a lot of power, but, doesn't talk a lot about it. So I think there are various ways of approaching elderhood that will resonate with each of us according to who we are, and how we, you know, care to present ourselves. But really, I think the if we look at other Indigenous cultures, particularly in the past and some contemporary Indigenous cultures, we don't see this terrible dismissal of old women. There is a recognition, certainly in many Native American cultures that I have spoken to elders of, there is a recognition that older women have a particular kind of power and steadiness precisely because they've gone through, they've kind of, the hormonal disruptions have kind of fallen away, precisely because they're not focused now on creating new kind of physical life, but the creativity is a power that stays within them. And I think that can lead to more insight into the culture. Again, as all of the stories show us, to this bigger picture perspective, not just because we've lived a long time and have kind of done some of this stuff, but just because you have this ability to step apart when you're less involved in the hurly-burly, in the fray of it all. And really, it seems to me that in a normal, healthy, sane culture, that quality of stillness and of ability to evaluate and to speak from the heart rather than from a position of wanting to still build things and grow things and have power over and everything, I think that would be valued. And I see our job as elder women now is to demonstrate the ways in which that can be valuable in order for the culture to value us.
There's a comment coming in here as well. It says, I can just read it here, but does Dr. Blackie believe there's a role elders will play in recreating their own initiation? In this sense, I hear that, like, how to sort of create that for each other in some sense, or is it sort of a burdening on younger generations in order to ask for that? Like, I see there's an interplay there, but he mentions one such wound, of course, which is oftentimes olders are shipped off to retirement homes or full on other elder villages, right, or older villages, right, where literally are sort of gated communities, which to me seems again like such a kind of odd anomaly of the West, that all of these storehouses of deep knowledge, I mean, just experiential, let's say, for some, are sort of clustered off right away from the daily life, where those interactions are actually so much of the generativity of this intergenerational wisdom. And so again, I wonder how we contend with that.
Yeah, it's a big issue, isn't it? A big question, rather. I think one of the things that I'm very interested in is precisely that, how we mark that initiation, how we begin to recognize when it's happening, because menopause has a tendency to creep up on people. You don't wake up one morning and say, okay, I'm in menopause, until you figure out what's actually happening. Life can have become very, very chaotic during the what people call perimenopausal years for quite a long time. So I'm interested in developing a toolbox which will help us understand what is happening, which will help us determine the point at which we want to actually sit down and say, okay, now I am in a full fling initiation. I've done the separation from the first half of my life. I'm bang there in the middle of the initiation. I'm in the underworld. I'm in the dark cave. I'm in the crucible, whatever metaphor you want to use. And again, what are the tools that will help me navigate that passage and make a return, the third part of the journey, separation, initiation, return, make a return that not only serves me, but serves the wider world. So we have a year-long program, which is just about to begin actually on Saturday, where I'm gathering together a collection of women from all around the world, from kind of perimenopause all the way through to quite advanced elderhood, to look at this and say, okay, what does that initiation look like? What would a vision quest aimed at elderhood for women look like? I bet it wouldn't be particularly heroic, like a lot of vision quests are now. I bet it would be a little bit gentler, probably, maybe, just as deep, but in a different kind of way. So all of these are really important questions. Don't quite have the answers yet, but come back in a year and we'll see.
Yeah, thank you for leaning into that. I can't help but ask too, the passing of a great elder figure, archetypal and human, I'll say, with the Queen, of course,
Mhm.
in your neck of the woods there. And, Canada, of course, is part of the Commonwealth. And so there's this sort of, mythic relationship, but I'd say certainly it's not as present in the way that it might be for those,
Right.
in the UK, of course. And I wonder, what do you see when you see the passing of the Queen from an archetypal layer as also a role of what she has been, what force has she been? Has she been this Hagitude? Has she been something else? I'd be curious to hear your take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the Queen is a complex one, and obviously, she had many flaws as well as many great wisdoms and ways of being in the world that which we needed. Now, the archetype of Queen in general is a kind of leadership role, and I'm not sure that our Queen was quite that in all of the ways that you would expect. So, her approach to being a Queen, partly because it's written into the British Constitution, but I think also because of her nature, was very much to show that quiet strength and steadiness, which I think people was which I think was the reason why people found her death such a great loss, because there was this sense of somebody actually steering the ship, not making a song and dance about it, but by example. And in a sense, I would say that the Queen is a kind of example of the archetype of the truth teller, because in my view, truth telling isn't all about blurting out whatever you want people to hear for the sound of your own, the sake of the sound of your own voice, but it's about living as an example to people for some important truth in the world. And I think the Queen, in focusing so profoundly on service for all of those years, yes, she was privileged, but goodness me, she worked hard for her privilege. Focusing on service, on dedication, on duty, joyfully, not kind of like, with resignation, and steadily for all of those years, is a really interesting iteration of the Queen archetype. And, it's hard to imagine that we would ever see that again.
Hmm. Well, we have just a few more minutes left in this lovely conversation. And one, I'd like to ask, do you remember, and you might speak about it in the book, and I didn't get to that part, but there, like a particular interaction when you were younger with, an elder, a Hagitude, moment in your youth that really stood out for you, right? That you really thought, like, wow, this affected me, and I can see how it's affected me because there was a willingness to model or just some interaction, with an older that really, yeah, stood out to you. I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, I didn't in a sense, in that I never had an elder mentor, which I would have loved. My grandmother was a very quiet, downtrodden woman with a very violent husband who, was frightened by her own shadow. But she was unusual, in the sense that I grew up in the far northeast of England, in a profoundly deprived working class area. But I was raised, because my mother was out at least two jobs. I was raised by my great aunt, who clearly was very, very much older. And she was part of a cluster of elder women in that deprived working class environment in the north back then, which would have been in the 1960s, who had a surprising amount of power. Now, they didn't have financial power, and they didn't look as if they were running the household, but they were, in a sense, the kind of moral voice of the community. They weren't always kind about it, but they told people very, very clearly when they were overstepping some mark, if they weren't pulling their weight, if they weren't getting a job, if they were dressed like tarts, let's say, to use my great aunt's language. And there was a sense that they would stand on the doorsteps with their arms folded and kind of like look up and down the road to see what was going on and who was coming along. And they were respected because they were almost always right, because they were portraying a concept of kind of working class culture, which was about strong working values and a morality that they thought was functional. And so I think, in a sense, although, as I say, they weren't always nice, they weren't always kind, the fact that I did grow up in an environment where there were these strong old women that quite a lot of people were quite frightened of, really always made me believe that there was a role for older women. I think it's diminished now, perhaps, in that culture, but certainly back in the day, it was really very strong, and it stayed with me ever since.
Hmm. It's just, yeah, I see that image of the women kind of there looking out at the street and really have their sense of the pulse of things, which I think
Yeah.
is, so much of that function is to really see, all the different layers, all the different relationships, what needs tending, who needs a little bit of, what kind of medicine, and as a necessary, ballast to a society. So I'd
Indeed.
love to end, with just a line here, which I just loved, and I'll read it out. You say, "Because stories are spells, they change things. Then they hook us and reel us into their magic. They change us. It's the stories that will save us in the end." I'd love just to hear just a little about that before, one more note about your program, and then we'll close out for the day.
Yeah, I mean, I really well, clearly, I've read stories ever since I was a child. I mean, fairy tales were what I hung on to when I was growing up in the face of a difficult environment. But then I started to work with them as a psychologist when I was very much older, and in the face of any problem that anybody comes to you with, a story can help you imagine a way out of it. And in that sense, as psychological therapy, they are absolutely unique because they can capture the imagination in a way that no other therapy that I have ever worked with can. And they can help you see a way out. I mean, look at most of the fairy stories that we're familiar with. They're about overcoming the odds in what appear to be impossible situations. And no matter how downtrodden you are, no matter how it feels as if you're going to die, there is always something that can help you see it differently. So to me, stories really have at the heart of them this power for transformation, and it's kind of, stories give us that kind of superpower in a sense to imagine our way out of any impossible situation, to reinvent ourselves, to reimagine the world around us. So that is why I think they are so very important, and why the characters in them are such shining beacons of light for how we might reimagine ourselves at times of challenge.
Mhm. Beautiful. Well, I'd love for anyone listening as well here and in the time to come. Yeah, maybe you say one more word about your program that I understand, launches this Saturday.
Yeah, again, it's a year-long membership program where we're going to be looking not just at the things that I write about in Hagitude, because that's all in the book, but where we are really going to be looking at what resources we need to raise the profile, I suppose, of powerful elder women in the world, and how we can help others to reimagine the second half of their own life. So it is about things, very practical things like, collecting more stories, more than I had room for in Hagitude, that will give us different perspectives and perhaps, introduce new archetypes, as well as finding the kind of psychological and imaginal tools for us as individuals to really reimagine ourselves into a kind of more meaningful and authentic elderhood. So yeah, that starts on Saturday.
Beautiful. Well, blessings on the start of this new year program of yours. And always such a pleasure. Sharon, thank you for making the time and to talk about your new work here, and to all those who tuned in and those who will listen in the time to come.
Thank you so much, Ian. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Crow's Nest. Please consider writing a review on Apple Podcasts and sharing this episode with your friends. To learn more about the School of Mythopoetics and attend our upcoming events, visit schoolofmythopoetics.com.